Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the March edition of the Economic Club of Traverse City. We're glad you're here. I'm Kathleen Guy, the president of the club, president of your board, and really happy to know that you're out there today, even though I can't see you. Today, we're looking forward to our remarks from Dr. Samuel Gregg from the Acton Institute, and I'll introduce Dr. Gregg to you momentarily. We have a powerful lineup of speakers for this calendar year. And for the time being, we're going to continue meeting via Zoom. We thank heavens for the technology, but want to be sure that when we can come together, we can have a safe gathering face to face. And I know you're as eager for that to happen as your board is. So stay tuned. We'll eagerly await that day. In the meantime, I said again, we're grateful for this technology and the ability to bring quality speakers to you like our speaker today. Dr. Gregg is actually speaking to us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin today. So technology is great. During our session today, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by using either the chat button at the base of your screen or the Q&A button. Either will work. And you don't need to wait until the end of the presentation to enter a question. As it occurs to you, feel free to do so throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in, and then we can present them to our speaker when he finishes his remarks. Now for a few words today about our speaker. Dr. Samuel Gregg is Research Director at the Acton Institute, which is headquartered in Grand Rapids. He's also a visiting scholar at the Fulner Institute at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. The Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty is named after the great English historian, Lord John Acton, who's best known for his famous remark, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." This proverbial saying conveys the opinion that as a person's power increases, their moral sense diminishes. The Acton Institute organizes seminars aimed at educating religious leaders of all denominations, business executives, entrepreneurs, university professors, and academic researchers in economics, principles, and in the connection that can exist between virtue and economic thinking. Dr. Gregg has written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, ethics and finance, and natural law theory. He has a master's degree from Melbourne University in Australia and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in moral philosophy and political economy from Oxford. He is the author of 13 books, including his prize-winning The Commercial Society, and his most recent book, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. Two of his books have been shortlisted for the Conservative Book of the Year. He publishes in numerous journals, such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Oxford Analytica, and Foreign Affairs. He's also a regular author of op-ed pieces, which have appeared nationally and internationally in the Wall Street Journal Europe, the National Review, and the Jerusalem Post. His topic for today, the case against economic nationalism. I know you join me in welcoming Dr. Samuel Gregg.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that very kind introduction. And it's very good to be with you today, albeit virtually. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to speak to you at the Economic Club of Traverse City. And I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing us together today, as well as for the chance to talk about a subject which I suspect is on many people's minds these days. I think it's fair to say that over the past 5 to 6 years, we have seen a decisive shift among significant parts of America's population, but also populations around the world, a significant shift away from what you might call free trade orientated policies. Times, in fact, are very tough for what you might call market liberalism right now. We see pressures to embrace protectionist policies intensifying across the United States and elsewhere. We're also seeing increasing calls for the federal government, but also state governments, to intervene more widely in the American economy to try and bolster and protect those occupations, those industries, those particular regions that are often considered to be net losers from the process of economic globalization. So many people who I'll call economic nationalists in the United States and elsewhere are today arguing in favor of using state power, be it at the level of tariffs or internal questions like industrial policy, to try and more actively shape economic life in order to realize some very specific economic goals. Now, what's interesting about this is that market liberals, free traders, and I consider myself one of them, have generally responded to this by defending free trade, defending free markets, and pointing out the benefits of these things, both for relations between countries, but also internally, the ways in which free trade and open markets have benefited directly large numbers, in fact, millions of Americans, be it in terms of lower prices for goods or in terms of the opening up of export markets for American businesses and corporations. And that's fine. We need to have that type of reaffirmation of the importance of economic liberty at the domestic level and at the international level. But at the same time, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are in favor of free trade, like myself, to articulate critiques of this growing argument for more economic nationalist policies. And I'd like to spend some time today engaging in such a critique to point out what I think are some of the problems associated with economic nationalism and why I think economic nationalist policies are not in the best interests in the long term of the United States or American citizens. But before we do that, let's get to defining what we actually mean by economic nationalism. Now, of course, the easiest way to talk about economic nationalism is to say that economic nationalism is typically associated with protectionist policies. Policies like tariffs, subsidies, import quotas that seek to protect particular companies or particular industries in a given nation from foreign competition. In other cases, many economic nationalists have argued that emerging domestic industries require protection from foreign competition until they become sufficiently stable. So that's one manifestation of economic nationalism. Another manifestation occurs in the form of what's called industrial policy. So what's industrial policy? Well, broadly defined, industrial policy is any type of selective intervention or any government policy that attempts to alter the structure of production in a given country towards certain sectors of the economy that it's believed, it's hoped, will offer better prospects for economic growth than would occur in the absence of such intervention. So industrial policy involves using the state to try and secure different economic outcomes that would otherwise occur if you just let markets work. Now, the type of interventions I'm talking about go far beyond things like governments providing basic public works or making the type of necessary provisions for national defense with which free marketers and free traders from Adam Smith onwards have really no quarrel. But industrial policy involves using the government to act selectively, to try and shape a national economy structure rather than leaving this to markets operating in a context of rule of law and private property arrangements. Now, after 1945, virtually every Western country embraced industrial policies. The question was not so much whether one embraced industrial policy, the question was the degree to which industrial policy was embraced. And some of the goals pursued by those individuals pursuing industrial policy, they also varied. Sometimes industrial policy was introduced to try and correct what was perceived to be a market failure. In other occasions, the aim was to try and replace particular imports in order to encourage local production. In other words, to try and encourage the development of particular forms of agriculture in a country so that you don't have to rely upon agricultural imports from foreign countries. So this was pursued, as I said, in different countries to different degrees and with different variations. Let me give you one example which I think epitomizes a lot of what industrial policy looked like. So between 1945 and 1982, successive French governments pursued a range of industrial policies that became known as dirigeant. What this means is, it basically means not comprehensively trying to replace entrepreneurship and free prices and market-based allocations of production and investment. It was much more about essentially four things. First of all, the state nationalizing specific industries, especially utilities and energy companies that were considered too important for national well-being to be entrusted to the private sector. A second dimension was targeted investments and targeted government interventions into specific economic sectors through measures like subsidies, preferential tax treatment, government loans at below interest rates, etc. Third, the state assumed responsibility for infrastructure that went far beyond basic public works to provide services such as relatively sophisticated forms of telecommunications. And fourth, we also saw the government creating, managing, and sustaining, often through state-owned enterprises, particular industries like aerospace, defense, and nuclear energy, especially those sectors of the economy that were considered very important for national security and national prestige. So the impetus, the reason why these policies were often embarked upon was there was a desire, particularly in many European countries, to accelerate post-war recovery, to fast-track the economy's modernization, and realize certain national security goals. So sometimes it ended up with particular economic sectors being encouraged to try and develop a type of comparative advantage in the global marketplace. In other cases, industrial policy was embarked upon to try and preserve sectors like agriculture that were considered important for cultural and political reasons, and to protect them against foreign competition. So another aspect, another dimension of economic nationalism, I've just given you a description of how it worked out in Europe. Let me give you another way in which we can understand industrial policy and more broadly economic nationalism. And that's what you might call outright state capitalism, Now, I think we see this developing in, for example, mainland China, particularly from the mid-1990s onwards, and where we've seen the extensive involvement of the Chinese Communist Party, the state bureaucracy, and the Chinese military in pretty much all economic sectors. One expression of this type of policy, this state capitalism as a form of economic nationalism, was the greater use of fully or partly owned state enterprises throughout the economy, particularly after 1989. Now, these businesses today are closely monitored and directed by party state and military officials. They're also subject to extensive regulation at the local, regional, and national level. And this has been accompanied by long-standing efforts to gradually narrow and limit the amount of genuinely private enterprise that exists in mainland China today. One of the things that the current regime has been doing, for example, is gradually bringing more and more of what were, for example, partly owned state enterprises into full state ownership status. So this has been going on for quite some time. Now, in the case of China, economic nationalism involves some openness to foreign trade and capital, but that has been declining since the mid-2000s, and it's accelerated since 2012 under China's present leadership. So that's state capitalism. What about economic nationalism more generally? Well, I think it's true to say that today's economic nationalists, particularly those in the United States, they're not proposing to engage in a wholesale dismantling of the market economy. They're not proposing, at least in most cases, to embrace something like state capitalism. But they do think that nations, including the United States, should rethink and sometimes reverse the diminishment of protectionist measures that were initiated by the 1947 GATT agreement. Other economic nationalists want to accompany this by expanding existing industrial policies and experiment with new industrial policies throughout the United States. So that's a summary of economic nationalism, a little bit of its history, a little bit of its background, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that, especially when it comes to the topic of China. But let me tell you now, having defined and given, I think, a pretty fair description of what economic nationalism involves, let's talk about some of the reasons why, at least I think, it's problematic. Now, I think the attraction of economic nationalist policies is that they hold out the promise of immediate action to try and reverse economic decline and promote national greatness. The problem is that the evidence suggests that these types of measures, especially when they're maintained in place indefinitely, have very long-term negative effects upon national well-being. In the first place, economic nationalism makes it harder for individuals, regions, and nations to discover their comparative advantage. Now, I probably don't need to explain what comparative advantage is to this group, but broadly speaking, it means that a nation gains by exporting what it has a comparative advantage in producing and importing those things which other countries have a comparative advantage in producing. So this is more or less what comparative advantage is, and you find this articulated initially in some of the works of Adam Smith, and people like David Ricardo took the argument even further. But protectionism, one of the problems of protectionism, which is such a centerpiece of economic nationalist thinking, is that it gradually dulls and weakens our sense of what our comparative advantage is, whether it's as a nation, a region, or individuals. Because tariffs, subsidies, and import quotas, what do they try to do? They try to offset foreign competition's impact upon a given industry. And sometimes they occasionally succeed, at least for a while. Unfortunately, one side effect of this is that this type of protectionism discourages industries from adapting and from becoming more efficient under the pressure of foreign competition. In fact, the more you protect an industry, the more inefficient and the more inflexible it is likely to come. Now, economic nationalists will point out correctly that protectionist measures were, I think, as we know, a major feature of American trade policy up until 1947. And in fact, these policies were expanded and grew after the Civil War. Now, many people would argue, economic nationalists would argue, that one of the reasons that America became an economic superpower by 1890 was because of these types of protectionist measures. Well, the problem with that argument is that there's widespread evidence that protectionist measures actually impeded America's march to becoming an economic superpower in the late 19th century. Perhaps the most distinguished writer about trade policy in the United States today is the economist Douglas Irwin. He's at Dartmouth. And he engaged in a detailed analysis of the late 19th century American economy. He argues that if you want to understand why America grew so enormously at this period, it had very little to do with protectionism. It had to do with population growth, entrepreneurship, and capital accumulation. He also points out that productivity growth in the United States was lacking precisely in those economic sectors that were heavily protected, and that economic productivity in the United States at this time was heavily correlated to those parts of the economy that did not receive tariff protection. So another thing we've learned over time is that protectionist measures did considerable damage to the 20th century American economy. A very good example of this, again, which I probably don't have to mention to this group, is the Smoot-Hawley 1930 Tariff Act. So this act, which was passed in the 1930s as a consequence of America trying to react to the Depression, it resulted in something like tariffs being increased on something like 20,000 imports. Now, what did this do? Well, for one thing, it resulted in higher prices for American consumers during the Great Depression, which is probably not a time where you wanted to be artificially forcing prices up. It also provoked retaliation against America from other countries, thereby hurting those American businesses which produced goods and services for foreign markets. And as a consequence, America's share of world trade fell sharply in the 1930s. Yet another problem with the protectionist dimension of economic nationalism is it has some political implications which are very unhealthy. So for example, if we go back to the 1860s and we look at when some of the tariff acts were enacted, when we look at these and we look at the history of these, what's very clear is that those who drafted the tariff acts, particularly of 1864 and 1867, these acts were primarily drafted by guess who? Those businesses that wanted to get protection. So what this had the effect of doing, these acts, the effect was to put money into the pockets of private individuals and businesses who had very good political connections. So what I'm talking about here, of course, is cronyism and the way that protectionism fuels cronyism. A similar picture, by the way, emerges of cronyism and its relationship to tariffs if we look again at the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930. When you look at the detail of this particular legislation, you realize that it had very little to do with national interest, because predictably, as soon as industries and businesses became aware that there was going to be an increase in tariffs across the board, what happened? Well, the drafting of the Smoot-Hawley Act was characterized by things like log rolling, special interest politics, and above all, it was reflected the inability of members of Congress to think beyond their own district. So ironically, the protectionist measures, the tariff measures associated with Smoot-Hawley, which is clear economic nationalism, it actually encouraged legislators to put sectional interests first rather than the nation's well-being. That's a rather paradoxical position for economic nationalists to be in. Now, similar problems, I think, manifest themselves in the realm of industrial policy. So we've talked about protectionism and its problems. Let's talk about industrial policy and its problems. I think if you're looking for a good case study of the problems associated with industrial policy, we only need look at the example of Japan. Now, in the 1980s, I can recall being at school and being told that Japan was going to basically outpace the United States and become the world's economic superpower. I remember these arguments very well. I remember films coming out that were talking about how Japan's economic influence was going to surpass that of the United States. And it's true that Japan's recovery from World War II was indeed remarkable. Some of the reasons for this include high rates of domestic private savings, significant levels of domestic economic freedom, and comparatively low tax rates. So at the same time, we find that the extensive use of industrial policy is often cited by some people as a major reason for Japan's economic success. So Japan used tariffs, it used subsidies. It also involved using things like industrial policies such as trying to force mergers of companies and trying to control who owned things like manufacturing rights. In fact, so powerful what was called Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, so powerful was it that, and its efforts to try and outguess the market, that the very phrase industrial policy became synonymous with the Japanese model. But by the 1990s, just as everyone was starting to say Japan was going to be the economic superpower, Japan's economy began slipping into what was called the lost 20 years. Now, the reasons for this are many. They include an aging population, heavy private sector indebtedness, serious errors at the level of monetary policy, and lots of asset bubbles. But industrial policy had also played a major role in Japan's decline. And in fact, as no less than Japan's Ministry of Finance stated in 2002, quote, "The Japanese model was not the source of Japanese competitiveness, but the cause of our failure." End quote. So what did they mean by this? Well, in the first place, what they meant was that the proceeds of industrial policy had been, surprise, surprise, heavily tilted to those businesses politically connected to the Liberal Democratic Party, which dominated Japanese politics between 1955 and 1993. This undermined efficiency and facilitated widespread cronyism. Second, industrial policy in Japan, like it does everywhere else, involves state officials trying to second guess the insights and choices of millions of entrepreneurs, businesses, and investors and consumers. Because at the heart of industrial policy is the assumption that governments can often better identify which industries are more worthy of investment than others. But that supposition, that presumption, runs afoul of what's called the knowledge problem. The knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem is this, that no individual, no ministry, no cabinet, no government can acquire and process all the information that's needed to determine a nation's optimal economic structure at any one point in time, let alone in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. Moreover, government attempts to build up certain industries via preferential treatment. They also undermine the market's ability to furnish the accurate information that's needed by investors, entrepreneurs, and businesses if they are going to identify the most optimal economic path for each of them to follow. And that process constantly allows millions of piecemeal improvements to the overall economy. By contrast, if industrial policy becomes a central feature of economic life, I guarantee that inefficiencies will grow throughout the economy as people act on the basis of what is increasingly bad information. Now, as Japan and many other countries have discovered, that ends up serving no one. So, economic nationalists now today, they're saying things like, well, all of what you said may be true, but we simply can't allow, the argument goes, whole regions of America to slip into a type of economic decrepitude. We can't allow entire economic sectors to disappear. Now, changes in industries, particularly, for example, something like manufacturing, economic nationalists regularly attribute this type of decline to what they call unfair foreign competition. And yet, the changes we've seen in things like manufacturing have far more to do with technological change and shifts in comparative advantage than they have to do with foreign competition. So, for example, American manufacturing jobs declined from 19 million people, which was basically the peak of manufacturing employment in the United States, declined from 19 million people in 1979 to about 11 million people in 2016. So people say, well, this is bad, this is terrible. And yet, throughout the same period, total employment in America grew from 99 million people to 151 million people, and that dwarfed the loss of manufacturing jobs. And it's very clear that the net decline in manufacturing was driven by technological innovation, but also America developing its comparative advantage in high-skilled manufacturing. Because contrary to popular myth, America is not, in fact, deindustrializing. Lots of physical things continue to be produced in America, but what is being produced is different and the production is occurring much more efficiently. In fact, real manufacturing production grew by 180% between 1972 and 2007. And that's what happens when countries and industries are entrepreneurial, when they embrace new technology and they adjust to foreign and domestic competitive pressures. Conversely, tariffs and subsidies will over time facilitate significant inefficiencies in resource allocation and distort economic information and encourage cronyism. But I also think that the economic nationalist habit of blaming foreign competition for why particular industries have declined obscures some of the real reasons why some industries have undergone some decline in the United States. For example, could it be that decades of management complacency and acquiescence with unreasonable union demands have sapped the productivity of particular industrial sectors? Perhaps some businesses were reluctant to adapt to new technologies. Perhaps some businesses chose to invest more energy and time in playing the cronyism game. Perhaps many American industries have been nudged in particular directions by industrial policies that turned out to be less effective than were hoped for. So if all that is true, surely counterproductive to use industrial policy and protectionism to try and rectify the situation. Moreover, isn't it positively irresponsible to encourage Americans to go and enter particular occupations and industries that in the future are simply going to provide fewer employment opportunities, either because of declining comparative advantage or because of technological change? So I could say much more about all the problems associated with economic nationalism. But let me conclude by saying this. A more general challenge that I think that economic nationalist policies can't deal with is that no one can know what is likely to be the future growth industries in America over the medium and long term. maybe in the short term, we can have some sense of what that will be. But in the medium to long term, no one knows what technological innovation or entrepreneurial insight is going to upend the present economic landscape in America or any other country, nor can such developments be anticipated by economic nationalist policies. By all means, America should be confronting countries like China that, among other things, steal intellectual property and routinely violate World Trade Organization rules. A concern for free trade, I think, certainly demands aggressive action in these areas. But in the long term, I think, economic nationalist policies, whether in the form of tariffs and protectionism, whether in the form of industrial policy, I think in the long term, the evidence is clear. Economic nationalism undermines the long-term interests of those countries that embrace such policies. And that, I think, is the central paradox which economic nationalists are failing to address today. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gregg. And we do have several questions here for you. And let me pose the first one. What do you think will happen with current tariffs put in place by the previous administration? And should they be used as leverage or removed?
Well, thank you. That's a great question because I actually, not least because I actually wrote something about this subject just recently.
We're playing to your hand.
Yes, you are. So let's talk about the Trump administration tariffs that were placed on imports of aluminium, right? So this was aluminium. These were put in place in, I want to say, 2017, and the goal of these tariffs was to protect steel industry jobs. Well, what's interesting about that is that a Federal Reserve report came out about a year and 9 months later. And what did this report say? It said, well, these protectionist measures, which included tariff increases of up to 25% on some products, these tariff increases, well, they may have saved a few thousand jobs, but they also cost 75,000 other jobs in those industries that are further downstream when it comes to using steel and aluminium as part of the products that they use. In other words, here's the thing. When you use tariffs, you're making a choice for one industry rather than another. And that choice often means making a choice for one industry at the expense of another. So those industries that are heavily reliant upon relatively cheap imports of aluminium found themselves having to pay more. And as a consequence of that, something like 75,000 American workers lost their jobs. So maybe you've saved 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 jobs in the steel industry, but you've cost 75,000 jobs in a range of other industries. How is that in the interests of the United States? How is that in the interests of workers? And that's, I think, is part of the issue here, is that there's a seen and unseen dimension to economics in general, but also when it comes to things like trade policy. When we design trade policies, we focus them usually upon, in terms of protectionism and tariffs, we typically direct them at one particular segment of the economy, but we don't think about the way it's going to affect other parts of the economy. And this is one of the perpetual problems with tariffs and protectionism. These unseen, unforeseen effects that only become apparent a year and a half later when people start losing their jobs.
Okay. Next question. From your perspective, who are the biggest winners and losers of the previous administration's trade policies?
Well, there's a lot of different answers to that. Well, first of all, one thing I think that the Trump administration did do, which was a good move, was to start invoking World Trade Organization rules against China, because China, as we know, routinely violates these things all the time and really wasn't being aggressively called to account for its behavior in this area. So that's one thing I think was good. A second thing I think which the Trump administration did, which was very good, was to start clamping down and prosecuting Chinese nationals and Chinese businesses that have been engaged in intellectual property theft, which is wrong in itself, but also in violation of all sorts of laws, domestic and international. So the increase in prosecutions of Chinese nationals and Chinese businesses engaged in intellectual property theft was a very good move. A third thing, which I think was a good move on the part of the Trump administration, was to make Chinese firms, Chinese financial businesses, investment houses that were getting into the action on Wall Street start to play by the same rules of accountability and disclosure that American companies were operating under. So, you know, this will probably surprise a lot of people, but a lot of Chinese investment houses and financial businesses were exempt from some of the same rules that American financial houses were playing under within the domestic American economy. So what they did there was effectively say, everyone's playing by the same rules. Just because you're from China doesn't mean that you're somehow exempt anymore. So those are some examples of good things which I think were done by the Trump administration that had direct implications for America's trade and economic relationship with China. The downside, I think, was some of the tariff policies. I think they ended up being counterproductive. Now, the question of leverage was raised, which I think is an important one. And if you go back as far as Adam Smith said, who was obviously very against protectionism, very against tariffs, very against all these things. He said there were two main exceptions that he made for trade policy, two exceptions to his basically free trade position. One was national security, right? We don't allow companies to trade military technology with Russia or China. There are some things that are more important than economic prosperity, and national security is certainly one of them. So that's one thing. And I think one thing the Trump administration did do, which I think was good, was to give more attention to this national security dimension. Now, that can be abused, and lots of companies routinely try and get special exemptions on the basis that they somehow are very important for national security. And when you look very closely at what they're arguing for, it turns out that they're not actually that important for national security. I read recently of a fitness firm that claimed that it deserved some particular protection because the manufacturing of exercise equipment was really important for national security because it meant that Americans would be fitter. I mean, that's the type of, I wish I was exaggerating, but that's the type of thing you often see floated. But the leverage thing, Adam Smith also said that one case in which he could see using tariffs was as a form of leverage to try and get other countries to change their position. Now, he said that should be used very selectively, and you should go in, if you're going to do that, you should go into it with your eyes wide open, because you have to be assuming that the effects of the trade policy or the tariff or whatever it is on the country that you're trying to get to change its behavior will be worse than the costs that you inflict on your own population, particularly consumers, when you place tariffs on, say, imports from other countries. So the leverage game is something which governments do all the time, which the Trump administration has certainly did, in which the Biden administration, by the way, has not ruled out doing this. In fact, I was reading how the newly appointed trade representative, I can't recall her name right now, but she was confirmed this week, and she has said that the use of tariffs is not off the table when it comes to dealing with China. So it's a form of leverage which can be used, but it's a very delicate tool, and you have to make sure that it doesn't backfire on you. And you have to have some confidence that it will change the behavior of the country you're trying to influence. And at the moment, with regard to China, I think the jury is out on that.
Okay. You had referenced in your remarks earlier about Japan and our earlier policies with regard to Japanese trade.
Right.
And this questioner said, how do you explain how Japanese cars are always perceived better than US automobiles?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is good marketing. The Japanese are very good at marketing this. So they've been very successful in promoting a vision of Japanese automobiles as being sleeker, more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing. The second thing is that the American car industry, and of course, I've lived in Michigan for a long period of time. My wife's family come from a long line of auto executives, so I know all about this world.
Lively dinner table conversation.
Well, oh yes. Well, it's not easy to be a free trader at some of those discussions. Although, I tell you what, within a few years, they had started to shift their thinking. Now, here's some of the reasons why. I think the problems of the American car industry have had a lot less to do with Japan and much more to do with, and I alluded to this in my remarks, bad decisions made by American car companies, particularly the big three in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Rather than saying, okay, we need to compete with the Japanese, we're going to ask for more tariffs. That was one problem. Another problem was, and I distinctly remember a car executive who's now deceased, but was very senior in the car industry, saying to me, we never really confronted the unions about the extravagant demands that they were making. We became too complacent. We, management, became too complacent with the status quo. So in other words, we didn't adjust to the pressures of foreign competition, and we didn't do what needed to be done to make the very difficult and challenging decisions that needed to be made to allow our workforce to be more flexible and for us to adapt to technology faster. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing, it's very easy to say, well, the Japanese, they have tariffs, they have subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those tariffs and subsidies also cost the Japanese a lot as well. I'm more inclined to think that the problems of the American car industry have much more to do with decisions that were not taken, but should have been taken in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And tariffs and subsidies and all those things, in a way, sort of put off the making of hard decisions. But as a consequence, we've seen the American car industry bailed out, what, 3 times now? So, I mean, this is a classic example, I think, of where economic nationalist policies, tariffs, protectionism, et cetera, in the long term, they damage an industry's competitiveness.
Okay. Here's another one.
Mm-hmm.
How will protectionism affect the future of industries such as clean energy, which now we all realize will be a big part of our future?
Does anyone remember the company Solyndra?
Certainly do.
Okay. Well, we've been down this path before, haven't we? So for those very few people who have not heard of Solyndra, Solyndra was, of course, the energy company that was the Obama administration's golden child, great example of a type of industrial policy used to fuel the development of clean energy. That was the whole argument for the Obama administration, basically adopting a type of industrial policy towards this particular company with the goal of encouraging and facilitating more green energy and a wider shift to clean energy across the United States. Well, Solyndra didn't work out so well. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One was there's a fair amount of cronyism that was involved. And cronyism, I think, is very difficult in any case to separate from any form of industrial policy. Secondly, it turned out that Solyndra wasn't particularly effective or efficient. And in other words, it wasn't competitive. People didn't want its products. And that's the thing about industrial policy. In the end, you can't make people want to buy something. Have to make that choice themselves. So that was another problem. And so the whole thing ended up as a disaster. Now, my concern is that the Biden administration has made it very clear, crystal clear, that they want to put the petroleum industry out of business over the long term. I mean, President Biden basically said that in one of the debates, I think, last year. And they want to facilitate the shift to clean energy via industrial policy. I don't see any reason why that won't be subject to all the usual inefficiencies we associate with industrial policy, all the cronyism, all the furnishing of bad information for the rest of the economy. So there's no problem with companies and entrepreneurs exploring clean energy alternatives, trying to find alternatives to fossil fuels. That's fine. That's in a market, you would want that sort of thing to happen. But when the government gets into the business of doing this, of trying to facilitate it, I think you're going to end up with a Solyndra type of situation on a much bigger scale. By the way, I think some of the problems that Texas recently had with its, the state which is most associated with petroleum industry, some of the problems it had recently during that very bad winter snap that we all recall, a lot of that had to do with the fact that Texas has moved a lot of things in the direction of clean energy, and a lot of that was driven by industrial policies. And it turned out that this green energy and sources weren't so good at coping with severe cold weather. So this is another example of where industrial policy doesn't anticipate these things. It can't anticipate these types of problems. So clean energy, that's great. Market-driven clean energy, fantastic. Government-driven clean energy, bound to have all sorts of unintended consequences that will not be very good for consumers or for the energy industry as a whole.
Okay. Here's another green energy related question. As the US is moving more toward a green economy, which requires a large amount of rare earth minerals, how do we deal with China's comparative advantage on rare earth minerals as they hold most of the world's reserves?
Well, a couple of things. One is that these sort of rare minerals, well, the Chinese have been buying this stuff up for a very long time. They're not stupid. They're focusing upon these types of things because they believe that that's where a lot of the future is lying. And that's true to a certain extent. But at the same time, if the Chinese have to sell that to someone, I mean, this is the thing. You can try and capture as much of the world market of a particular product or whatever it is, be it oil, rare minerals, or whatever it happens to be. But that is useless to you unless you can actually sell it to other people. So there's no point China owning all this stuff unless they're in a position to be able to sell it to other countries. So they can sit on this for as long as they like, but it's not of any value to them unless they're willing to get it out and sell it in the marketplace, which means they have to be willing to go and trade it with other countries. And I tell you this, I mean, if they think they can hold the world to ransom about this, well, that's fine, they can think that, but one of the benefits of living in a relatively dynamic market economy is that alternatives to rare minerals as a source of green energy can be found, will be found, if there's enough incentive for entrepreneurs to be given to follow and try and find these alternative bases for green energy. So I'm not too worried about it. Of course, the Chinese will use this as a type of leverage in their broader geopolitical game. But in the end, they've got to sell it to someone. They have to sell it to someone. And that someone is the rest of the world. So at some point, they're going to have to engage with the rest of the world on this. They can't just sit on it and just pretend that somehow that is all they need to do in this particular area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Was passing the TTP agreement a good thing for the U.S.?
You know, here's the thing about any trade policy. The devil is in the detail, right? So, because here's the thing: when people often say to me, "Well, we live in this free trade world, and it's been very bad, et cetera, et cetera," and I say, "Well, you know, we don't really have free trade. What we do have are lots of trade agreements, right? So that's how trade is manifested today. And when you look at trade agreements, they're not one page that says there shall be free trade between the United States and Japan, or the United States and the European Union, or whatever it is. These trade agreements are, you know, this thick, and they're full of negotiated provisions, negotiated agreements between one country and another, or several countries in a trade pact, which have been negotiated to the nth degree, and those negotiations are heavily influenced by political interest groups in the countries that are negotiating, by businesses that are in those countries, by unions that are in those countries, by environmental groups, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at any trade policy, I think you have to go and say, okay, well, let's look at the detail of this and say, is this a net win or a net loss? Now, that's very difficult to calculate because you don't know how these things are going to play out over time. So I can't give a precise response to the TTP thing, because I think I'd really need to look at the detail and then make some sort of assessment as to whether the net negotiation turns out to be a benefit to the United States or a net loss. And we won't know that for a long period of time.
Ah, that devil. Okay, last question for you. How would you characterize the implementation of a carbon tax within the context of industrial policy?
Well, a couple of things. One is the cost of a carbon tax will, as what happens with most taxes put on industries or businesses, businesses won't pay for that. That will simply be passed on to consumers, right? That's what businesses do. When a tax increase occurs, the tax increase, the cost of that is simply passed on to consumers. That's all tariffs do that, by the way, right? All tariffs are, in fact, a tax that's exerted upon anyone who's buying a particular product to which has been subject to some type of tariff. So a carbon tax, I think that's simply be passed on to consumers. It means that the price of energy will grow to the extent that that tax is there forever. Will it change people's behavior when it comes to using fossil fuels? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the world market when it comes to petroleum. So I'm not even sure that a carbon tax will have the necessary environmental consequences that people who argue for these things are in favor of. I'm not sure that it will do very much to the petroleum industry. So I think that's a very good example of a tax that's being designed to try and achieve a particular policy goal that I don't think will have much effect unless you raised it to something like 100% or 150% or something like that. But in a country like America, where where Americans are, as I'm sure you all know, the price of gas is so much less than most other countries. I find it very difficult to believe that even in an environment where there's an increased environmental consciousness, I find it very difficult to believe that an administration would have too much success in getting such a thing passed. And even if they did, I'm not sure that it would have the effects that they hope it would.
Okay, thank you. We had several more questions that were asked, but we don't have time to follow up on. So perhaps if we could impose on you, post this current Zoom to provide some of the responses to some of our audience questions, that would be terrific.
Sure.
And I have to say that this has been an excellent example of adult education for me, and I'm sure for many of our members today. So we appreciate your being with us today and sharing your perspectives with us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciated the questions. They're all very much on point. And I'm very happy. I mean, if people are interested in learning more about these things, if you just Google my name and the word my name and economic nationalism, you'll see a lot of things pop up. And you'll find much more detail about some of the questions we've been talking about today, as well as you'll see articles where I engage in direct debates with economic nationalists about some of these questions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all to our Economic Club members for joining us today. We appreciate your experience that has led to some really great questions for our speaker, and look forward to seeing you for the April edition of the Economic Club of Traverse City. In the meantime, just a reminder that our essay contest for area high school students has begun, and we will see the results of that coming in. We've got some very dedicated readers, I think somewhere between 15 and 20, who have agreed to be readers for the contest this year. And the contest is under the leadership of Ron Jolly, also a member of our board. So look forward to future developments with the contest and to meeting our winners later this spring. So again, thank you, Dr. Gregg, and we are adjourned for today.